Hey Infotron, how's the research on the episode going?
Information overload. I am corrupted.
Infotron? Whoa! Oh, hi! You caught me dealing with a shooter. Speaking of shooter, let's talk about Jim Shooter.
Comic tropes. Comic tropes.
Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Today, I want to talk about the rising and falling fortunes of an important figure in comics. This is an individual who has had as much success as anyone in comics has had, and yet he's also had an equal number of setbacks. I want to talk about the creative and smart man who has also rubbed people socially the wrong way. I want to talk about Jim Shooter. Let's talk about how he works so that we can try to understand how this guy has brought Marvel Comics to its greatest success ever, only to be unceremoniously fired and then to go through the same thing at least 2 more times. So, without any further ado, let's talk about Jim Shooter. Jim Shooter was born in Pittsburgh in 1951. In 1963, at age 12, Shooter was recovering from minor surgery at the hospital, and there wasn't much to do except read comics. He noted that the DC comics were very similar to the ones he'd read when he was younger, but the Marvel comics, which had debuted just 2 years earlier, were different. More grounded, with people in the real world, and with characters that had flaws and problems in their personal lives. He spent a year reading both and comparing them, feeling that DC needed help. In 1965, he sent some scripts and art for Legion of Superhero stories to DC Comics. Editor Mort Weisinger bought them and commissioned him to write Supergirl and Superman and eventually write Legion stories as well. He was only 14 years old, still the youngest writer for any major publisher. As a teenager, he created Legion characters like Karate Kid and Pharaoh Lad, as well as villains the Fatal Five and the Sun Eater. He also created Superman villain Parasite, and worked with artist Kurt Swan on the Flash vs. Superman foot race story, Superman's Race with the Flash. Jim Shooter displayed great storytelling skills at an incredibly young age. He was there nearly from the very beginning of the Silver Age, competing against men nearly twice his age, maybe even more, for work. So he has been actually creating stories for half a century at this point. In 1969, Shooter began working as an editor at Marvel. He went back to DC to write Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, but he claims he did not get along with both Superman editor Julius Schwartz and Legion editor Murray Boltinoff because they had him perform more rewrites than he felt was necessary. So when Marvel asked him to return as an assistant editor and writer in January of 1976, he eagerly accepted. Marvel was growing quickly in the 70s, but part of that growth led to rapid turnover at the top. Stan Lee had been the original editor-in-chief, overseeing the Marvel titles, and he handed the reins over to Roy Thomas in 1972. But then the role became a revolving door as the editor-in-chief struggled to keep Marvel's books coming out on time. Between 1972 and 1978, there were 5 different editors-in-chief: Roy Thomas, Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, Jerry Conway, and Archie Goodwin. It was time for Marvel to get on the right track or to fall apart. Jim Shooter was installed as editor-in-chief in 1978, and his first priority was making sure that Marvel's comics came out on time. Marvel had been plagued with delays, and it was costing them a fortune with their printers. What Shooter did was install a bunch of different group editors over various titles that would all report up to him. He began to exert very tight control over the comics that he was editing, and Marvel began to soar under his leadership. Along with the books being released on time, Shooter began courting all the top creators in the industry. He installed a new royalty system that rewarded the writers and artists for books selling well. He also took big steps towards treating creators the right way, famously returning Jack Kirby's original artwork to him. In 1981, Shooter launched the Epic imprint within Marvel that allowed creators to publish work where they retained the full rights to their creations. This meant Marvel, through the Epic imprint, was publishing work by top-tier creators like Doug Moench, Paul Gulacy, and Jim Starlin, but also importing the best foreign creators like Mobius and Katsuhiro Otomo. During his tenure as editor-in-chief, Shooter oversaw acclaimed runs like Chris Claremont and John Byrne on X-Men, Walt Simonson on Thor, and Frank Miller on Daredevil. When a fan named Randy Schuler pitched the idea of a black stealth costume for Spider-Man, Shooter bought the idea for $220. He had artist Mike Zeck design it, and it was used in Secret Wars. Eventually, writer David Michelinie and artist Todd McFarlane transformed that suit into Venom. Marvel certainly spent its $220 well in that case. Whatever he was doing was certainly working on a business level. Shooter also introduced ideas like the first massive crossover event, Secret Wars, beating DC's Crisis to the punch, and putting a monthly title into the emerging direct sales market, publishing Dazzler #1 as an exclusive to comic book stores. Everything was bigger with Jim Shooter. Sales were incredible. Even a book like Dazzler was selling 160,000 copies, which was about 60,000 more copies than Superman at the same point in time. He liked big crossover events. He introduced things like Contest of Champions and Secret Wars. When he had been a writer, he liked that stuff as well. For instance, during his Avengers run, he wrote the Korvac saga, which used every single Avenger at that point, plus the Guardians of the Galaxy. When he was editor-in-chief, he was known for incredibly tight continuity between the various titles, but he also insisted that the stories were being told the way he wanted them to be told. Over his 9-year run as editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter also annoyed both the people that reported to him and the people he reported to. He annoyed the owners of Marvel Comics by extending some of the best page rates and royalties, while also irritating many creators who argued he insisted on the comics coming out the way he demanded. Writer and editor Roy Thomas had left Marvel under a contract dispute with Shooter, and in a 2005 interview he explained, "When Jim Shooter took over, for better or worse, he decided to rein things in. He wanted stories told the way he wanted them told. It's not a matter of whether Jim Shooter was right or wrong, it's a matter of a different approach. He was editor-in-chief and had a right to impose what he wanted to. I thought it was kind of dumb, but I don't think Jim was dumb. I think the approach was wrong, and I don't think it really helped anything." For instance, Shooter insisted that Jean Grey had to die at the end of the Dark Phoenix saga because she had killed an entire race of aliens as the Phoenix. He had fill-in issues written for Omega the Unknown to keep it coming out on time when writers Steve Gerber and Mary Screens fell behind on their creation. And there were bigger claims of interference by writers like Tony Isabella, who had written an arc on Ghost Rider where it would eventually be revealed that Jesus Christ was helping Ghost Rider against the devil. A hasty rewrite just before publishing had the character renamed to simply The Friend. At the time, Marv Wolfman was the editor-in-chief, and Shooter was just an assistant editor, but Isabella insists that Shooter performed the rewrite. By the end of his time as editor-in-chief, Shooter had lost top talent like John Byrne, Marv Wolfman, Gene Colan, Doug Moench, and Steve Gerber to rival DC Comics. Most creators were at least content with the payment and the rights Marvel was offering at the time. It wasn't perfect, but it was an improvement. At the same time, Jim Shooter's management style was pushing away and alienating some of the top creators. Everything about his management style can best be summed up in a look at Marvel's imprint, The New Universe, that Jim Shooter oversaw. Leading up to Marvel's 25th anniversary in 1986, Marvel's president and vice presidents, including editor-in-chief Jim Shooter, brainstormed new ideas to celebrate. One idea Jim Shooter pitched was similar to the eventual Ultimate line, where the current superhero titles at Marvel would end and be rebooted, set in the modern day. That idea was vetoed since sales were just fine on the titles that they already had. Shooter's next idea was the New Universe, which would be a superhero universe completely separate from the existing Marvel superheroes. It would not have any aliens, supernatural elements, or super technology. Tom DeFalco was selected to head it up as editor, but began to run late. Marvel itself had also cut back on the budget because they were thinking of selling themselves to a new owner and were trying to keep costs low. So Jim Shooter took control and outlined what the books would be about. He assigned editors to write the title and hired new talent, opting to write Starbrand himself. Shooter insisted on the talent to make comics the same way he insisted all Marvel comics be made. They had to consider story structure and to make sure that they were taking the time to establish characters and the issue's conflict right up front. Basics, but story basics that were being overlooked in the chaotic time in which Jim Shooter first took over at Marvel. There was now chaos in a rushed new line of comics. Without big names behind it, the new universe line utterly flopped, and the people working on the books did not seem to respect Shooter, and the people that took over the titles added a huge event where the entire city of Pittsburgh, Jim Shooter's hometown, was blown up and wiped off the map. Writer and artist John Byrne held a barbecue at his house and invited a bunch of Marvel employees. They burned an effigy of Jim Shooter there filled with copies of New Universe copies. When Marvel's new editors saw the video, the writing was on the wall and they fired Jim Shooter. So how did Jim Shooter get fired by Marvel? Well, there's a lot of different accounts out there, but most of them seem to agree that he had simply alienated people. He had alienated his higher-ups who were at the time trying to cut costs, and Jim Shooter was fighting for increased royalty payments and good health plans. And he'd also alienated the creators that worked for him with his tight control and insisting on things be done the way he wanted them to do. So when the Marvel executives finally made the choice to fire him, nobody at Marvel really had his back. Jim Shooter had good business acumen and good big ideas for characters, but sometimes his creative instincts weren't perfect. The Korvac saga was a great Avengers story, but most critics will agree that the finale fizzles out. He'd made other mistakes as a writer, like not addressing how violent Hank Pym came across by backhanding his wife Wasp. He kept some of the more progressive elements out of the comics. For instance, he wouldn't allow any gay characters in the comics. John Byrne kept Northstar and Alpha Flight coded gay, but it was never overt or explicitly stated. Jim Shooter himself had written a rampaging Hulk issue where some gay men at the YMCA attempted to rape Bruce Banner. He was a co-writer on the infamous Avengers number 200 issue, where Carol Danvers is brainwashed by the villain Marcus, impregnated by him, and the Avengers allow her to leave with him, never questioning the mental control Marcus states that he has over her. Jim Shooter was fired by Marvel in 1987. After a bit of freelancing, Shooter decided on his next move. He would buy Marvel Comics. Cadence was a conglomerate that owned Marvel and was looking to sell. Jim Shooter teamed up with an entertainment lawyer, Steve Mazarski, a former executive of Time Incorporated, Winston Folks, and a venture capital firm called Triumph. They put together a bid to buy Marvel, but they ended up coming up with the second highest bid, and the company was sold to Ron Perlman, a billionaire financier. But Shooter's new company, Voyager Communications, didn't want to give up on comics. They looked into the Harvey Comics characters, and then Jim set his sights on acquiring unused gold key characters Solar, Turok, and Magnus Robot Fighter. He had a relationship with the executive at Western Publishing that owned the characters back from his days at Marvel. But before Voyager could begin publishing superheroes, Mazarski wanted to try to make comics based on two companies he worked with, Nintendo and World Wrestling Federation, and Shooter began to lose leverage. Because at this point, Steve Mazarski had started a romantic relationship with the lady at the top of Triumph Capital. So between the two of them, they fired Winston Folks, and now all of a sudden, Jim Shooter was a minority stakeholder in the company that he'd helped found. Mazarski insisted that they try Nintendo and World Wrestling Federation comics. Jim Shooter obeyed. They did not sell at all, so the company, a little bit desperate, agreed to let Jim Shooter try his superhero ideas, and thus, the Valiant Universe was born. The Valiant Universe launched in May of 1991 with Magnus Robot Fighter, written by Jim Shooter himself. That was followed by Solar, Man of the Atom, Rai, and Harbinger. The latter two were original characters. Shooter began to bring in top talent like Bob Layton, fresh off an acclaimed run on Iron Man, and artist Barry Windsor Smith right after his Weapon X story. The initial sales were moderate, but the new trade magazine Wizard, the Guide to Comics, began to talk up Valiant and even featured their new character Exo Manowar on the cover of issue 7. The Valiant titles began selling incredibly well. The universe was built on Jim Shooter's ideas of character development and careful storytelling. The issues built to a crossover in 1992 called Unity that brought the various threads and books together. It was a big crossover like Secret Wars, and the premise of the Valiant universe was following Jim Shooter's ideas for the new universe, a grounded world where an event gives birth to a small number of superpowered beings. In 1992, Jim was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award by Diamond Distribution, but by the end of the year, Mazarsky and his team had fired Jim Shooter. The Valiant universe became more gimmick-driven after that, with chromium covers and issue zeros. 2 years after letting Shooter go, Valiant was sold to Acclaim, the video game developer, and the line of comics closed another 2 years after that. Acclaim eventually went bankrupt and sold off their Valiant characters to a new group of investors in 2005 that rebooted the line. Could Jim Shooter have avoided being let go by one of these companies that he helped build into a success? It's hard to say. Business is business, and certainly at Valiant, there were competing priorities from the other shareholders from day one. But you'd have to imagine that if Jim Shooter had better people skills, he could still be working for one of these companies. He has a good mind for business. He understands the audience, the comic book reading audience. He's proved that he can take an idea and make it work. He took the idea for New Universe and made it work for Valiant. And then he used that idea once more. Jim Shooter next launched Defiant Comics. It began in 1993, and the main title was going to be called Plasm, about an organic planet that had to be fed by conquering other planets. A military leader, Lorca, finds compassion for Earth and genetically modifies 5 ordinary people from New Jersey to prepare them for the eventual battle that will come. The title only lasted a year, and it was building up to a 4-issue crossover event that Defiant titles would have called Schism. Despite featuring the gorgeous artwork of up-and-coming artist David Lapham, who had broken into comics doing a WWF issue for Shooter, the company folded before the stories could be completed. When Defiant launched, Marvel Comics began a lawsuit aimed at the title Plasm, claiming it was similar to a title they planned to publish called Plasmer. While Jim Shooter eventually won the lawsuit, it cost the company $300,000 in legal fees, and it took a long time to fight. It drained the company's resources and cost them a planned action figure line that would have bolstered their finances. Without enough capital to keep running, Defiant shuttered its doors in early 1995. Jim Shooter immediately began Broadway Comics, an offshoot of Broadway Video Entertainment, producer of shows like Saturday Night Live. But this was the mid-90s when the comic book industry was collapsing. The line was dead within a year. From there, Jim Shooter has worked as a freelance editor and writer for Valiant in 1999 for a crossover event Unity 2000, but only 3 of 5 issues were published before they went out of business. He wrote for Dark Horse and DC, among other companies. Time will tell if Jim Shooter has another big run in comics, but what we can agree on are the facts. He was there as a young teenager right at the beginning of the Silver Age of comics. He was writing Superman as a teenager. He built Marvel into a big successful powerhouse in the 70s and 80s. And he launched a successful new superhero universe. These are all facts. There are a lot of conflicting reports about who Jim Shooter is as a person, but anyone who has had that much success is of course going to court controversy. As to where I fall, I think that he's a great editor and a very good writer. Is he annoying in person? I don't know. I haven't met the guy. I can only read the different reports and try to get back to the facts behind them. So really, I encourage you to read up yourself on Jim Shooter, read all the different conflicting reports, and try to find out what is consistent across all those stories. He's certainly had a lot of success and is a fascinating, fascinating character. I'll talk a little bit more about him, but first, let's wrap up this episode with a look at some fan art that came into the channel this week. BJ Duncan illustrated me as the man behind the mask just in time for Friday the 13th. Kelby Weaver drew me in a dynamic pose and includes his Instagram. Robin Osborne used a mix of pen and digital art to transform me into the Phantom, the ghost who walks. Vortex Punk sent in this dynamite artwork and includes his Twitter handle. Icky Batty created me as the Yellow Kid based on my recent Platinum Age of Comics episode. Wiley Parkhurst calls this piece Chris with Iron Deficient Man and some superheroes. Jess Kroll illustrated me as the Yellow Kid with an apt phrase on my shirt. Eric Sweetman made this caricature of me and includes his Instagram for more. Kent Hansen drew me being held up by his character, 18-Inch Detective, and includes his Instagram. It's a trifecta of Yellow Kids, thanks to artist Matthew Warby. Spanish artist Marty Capdevila sent in this colorful look at my videos, and you can see more of his comics on Instagram. Finally, M Comic Fan illustrated me side by side with All Might. If you would like to have some fan art featured on this channel, I'm happy to share that. Just make sure it has something to do with comic tropes specifically and send it in to this address, comictropes@gmail.com. Then I will not only show it, but I'll pick a winner to win a Gachapon prize that I picked up in Japan. So we've got the ball spinner here. Let's spin it around, see who wins this week. Wow. I loved talking about Jim Shooter this week. All right, it's number 10. Number 10 was this artwork, just to refresh your memory. I'll get your address, send you a Gachapon prize. Let's take a look at what you won. By the way, I do have a recommendation for where you can learn more about Jim Shooter. I found this interesting DVD. It's called Off the Record with Jim Shooter. So you can look that up online and you can order this. It's 5 hours of Jim Shooter talking about his full career. Now, of course, this is just one source. So I couldn't take everything he said as a fact because that's biased. But it did help me sort of back up a lot of the other information that I was looking into. It was pretty darn entertaining, I will say that. So let's see what Gachapon prize is won and pull that out here. All right. Oh, cool. It's some sort of like a whack-a-mole digital game. They've got these cute little sort of kitty cats here or something, and it's a digital game where you just push them when they light up. So that's pretty fun. I'll send that your way. Got plenty of Gachapon prizes. We'll go through that and take it from there. Folks, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate all the growth the channel has had. My goal right now is to try to get about 10% of my overall subscribers to become subscribers on my Patreon account at just $1. If you were willing to pledge even $1, I'd be doing fantastic, and my goal would be I could then do this channel full time. I've got a lot of ideas for additional content I could create if I had the time and the resources. Who knows? Maybe that'll happen. It becomes closer to reality every day thanks to all of you. And one thing I do think I will do on the Patreon channel shortly is create an additional supplementary video to this, because there were a lot of rumors and stuff about Jim Shooter that I really couldn't verify, so it didn't make sense to include it in this video. But with that sort of context in mind, I think I'd like to just sort of sit down in front of the camera and at least talk about some of these rumors, and maybe there'll be some replies on Patreon and we can have a discussion going about, you know, what we think of Jim Shooter. He's definitely a fascinating creator. So many people seem mad at him, but plenty of people also respect him. It seems like Chris Claremont, for instance, has really nice things to say about his time with Jim Shooter. At least in more recent years, he's said some nice things about him. That's a pretty big name that was working for him at the time. He would know best. Anyway, I really appreciate you all watching this. Remember, wash your damn hands and keep reading comics.